Okay, hopefully we're recording. My name is Don Sorrell. I'm an ag agent in Campbell County. I've been here in the county for a little over 30, almost 31 years now. So where I'm in, as they say, the short rows of my extension career. So as I look at soils, that's one of the things that we've promoted quite heavily over the years is soil testing and understanding and whatever you're producing, whether that's a lawn, a garden, or basically production crops in the field, understanding the soil is extremely important. So last week and this week, we're really just going to give you an overview of the soil and hopefully enable you to understand some of the basics and from there begin to create a better opportunity to develop your soil in a better way to suit your individual plants. And that's a key thing. As you look at the soil, we're really trying to match the soil as best we can with each plants that we're growing. So Mr. Field said he had blueberries, and that's, that soil condition is going to be quite different than it will be for most crops, because blueberries love low pHs, and there's not a lot of plants out there that really thrive and do in a very productive way under the pHs that blueberries actually thrive in. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started here this afternoon. Okay, as far as what we talked about last week, just a quick refresher. The Extension Office does have soil testing, and we do that free of charge. And we talked about the importance of getting soil samples, looking at different field situations and trying to analyze whether topography or past management history becomes an issue, but being able to get fields represented in a proper way, going the right depth, which in most cases is 4 to 6 inches. And very rarely will we actually go much below 6 inches with our soil probes, unless we're really tilling that soil fairly deeply and pulling up, deeper soil mass. If you can get that dried down and crumbled up, bring to the office, we're able to send that rather quickly to the UK Soils Lab there in Lexington. And usually this time of year, a week's time, week and a half, we can get results sent back to us via our computers. And from there, I interpret those lab results and then I make final recommendations based on those numbers on that report. So this is what you're going to get and back. So I think as someone that may not be familiar with these reports, one of the things I would encourage you to look at, don't get, other than soil pH, don't get all excited about the numbers at first glance. I would say that you can look at that very center there when it talks about how level the accuracy is, and those little arrows going to the right there, if they fall into that medium to high range, your soil has good fertility. If it's in that low to very low range, then we can say we really need to be concerned about additional nutrients in that soil. By far, maybe one of the most important things, we talked about this extensively last year, was the soil pH, and you see this particular sample has a pH of 6.3, and in most cases, with a few exceptions, soil pH is for good production of whatever you're growing is going to be often between, let's say 6.3, 6.4, and 7. So 7 being neutral and 6.3 just a little bit on the acid side. So most of our crops can take a little bit of an acid soils and do well in acid soils, but when we get pH is below, let's say 5.5 or so, we can really have significant health issues and production issues with plants. So on that soil sample, we're really looking at how can we best manage soil nutrients and what do we really need to amend. And we often look at, these are the three primary things that test is going to talk to you about early on, and that is, do you need to adjust the pH? Do you need to add limestone, which will raise the pH? Or in some cases, if you're dealing with a very acid-loving plant, do you need to add sulfur or aluminum sulfate to lower the pH? And we can actually give you specific guidelines on that. Two other nutrients that are extremely important is phosphorus and potassium, and we're going to talk about those tonight. And in some cases, depending upon the crop, we may get into and actually talk about the micronutrients that are in that soil that may play a major role in the production of individual plants. We showed this screen last week. In reality, you're looking at a fairly complex, but a fairly easy screen to look at as far as the left-hand side. So, the pH of between 6 and 7, you'll see that a lot of the nutrients that are in the soil that are needed for plant production, if you look at those bars there, the solubility, the availability of those nutrients are in that pH range between 6 and 7. So as we get below that or above that, then we can actually get into situations where our nutrients may not be as readily available, or in some cases, especially very acid soils, we can get into situations where we might have some toxicities, especially with aluminum and manganese, and in some cases iron. As we begin to look at soil fertility, and if you look at the right side of this, at the right bar there, it says possible production, and that is sort of looking at a corn plant or plants there. And as you look at fertility and its role in production agriculture or production of any crops you're trying to grow, fertility is one piece of that puzzle. Okay, it's an important piece, but you got to understand to reach that high level of production or beauty of any plant, you've got to have other things into place. So if you look there, we're always dealing with insects and diseases. Often we have more than our fair share of weed issues, and in some cases you might have different varieties of plants that can make a difference when it comes to disease resistance, for example. We did talk about the soil structure last week. If we get into compacted soils or soils that are extremely heavy in clay, or on the other end of the scale, very sandy, then those soils may not be near as productive. Or if we're planting, seeds in the soil and we get a poor stand, that can lead to reduced yield overall. And then, of course, fertility is another piece of this puzzle. And we can actually address soil fertility quite easily compared to some of these other things. And the very last thing, and maybe as much as anything that we don't always have total control over, is either the lack of moisture. We can always irrigate on a small scale, or if we have too much moisture, and we see that in some cases where moisture surplus becomes an issue with plant production and plant health. So from that standpoint, just understanding tonight, when we are looking at soil fertility, that's just one piece of the puzzle that can limit overall production. Okay. So as we look at this, the nutrients, the minerals that are needed primarily for plant growth, they're often separated into a couple groups. The macro minerals, which means basically these are the minerals that plants need a lot of, okay? So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fall under this. So those are the primary nutrients that are needed by most plants. And we'll get into all three of these. And we have the secondary micronutrients. They're also needed in the soil, in plant production, but the quantities that plants need are dramatically smaller than the macronutrients that are the primary ones, okay? And then depending upon the crops and the individual plant materials that we might be trying to grow, micronutrients can come into play quite heavily, okay? So boron, for example, is listed as a micronutrient, but it's something that we follow and we actually add to alfalfa production, okay? On the other end of the scale, we've got zinc, and it's an important micronutrient in corn production. And so in some cases, having adequate iron available to the plants, for example, with rhododendrons and even our oak trees that are in our lawns, sometimes we can get into situations where if we have too high soil pH, then some of those nutrients aren't readily available, even if they're in the soil. So understanding the micronutrients can play a major role in overall production and plant health. As we look at this, sort of the law of the minimum, and if you look at the barrel on the right, if we're looking at total yield or total production or just a nice vigorous plant, from a house plant that may be indoors to landscaping to your lawn, we're trying to find a balance as best we can with the nutrients that these individual plants need. And if you're looking at some deficiency, like you have on the left-hand barrel with, in that case, potassium being a deficient nutrient, you know, you can get into situations where one nutrient, one mineral can have a major role in overall production of a plant. And so with all of that said, you know, that's where our soil testing comes into play with some level of managing the nutrients that are available in the soil and making sure that they don't drop down into low to very low range. Soil pH air is sort of like the band around that barrel, sort of keeps everything and holds everything into place. And understanding what the pH is of your soil and what the pH range is for the individual plants that you're trying to grow. And so there is a range there, and but for the most part, we see that a large number of plants grow in that 6 to 7 pH range and are most productive in that range. Okay, as we look at going back to these individual samples that you're going to get back, if you look on the left-hand column here, and if I can bring my cursor into play here, you can see it. Over here on the left-hand side, you got phosphorus and potassium and soil pH. So phosphorus and potassium are the two primary nutrients that we will test for, okay? The one that's missing there is nitrogen, and we'll get into that quite heavily here this evening, but keep in mind that we test the soil. We don't often test for nitrogen because that is a nutrient that we often have to manage. We often have to add nitrogen. It's not often readily available in soils. Some soils will carry a little bit more nitrogen, especially if there is legumes in that crop in some form or fashion. So we'll cover that as well. You know, and when we deal with production agriculture, we often will be given recommendations based on pounds per acre, or in some cases like lime, we're actually given tons per acre as an amendment if it needs that much. On the other hand, if we're dealing with gardens and smaller landscapes and lawns, then the recommendations that are going to come back to you are going to be based often on pounds of an individual fertilizer or nutrient per 1,000 square feet. So just understand that as you deal with soil testing and as you get reports back, they may range from pounds per acre versus pounds per 1,000 square feet. These soil samples will give you additional information on the comments section of the samples, which can and will support what amendments, if any, that you need to apply, and will often give you examples of the fertilizers that might add those nutrients and actually tell you how many pounds to apply as well. One of the things I think is you look at this chart, and it represents the level of nutrients based on a scale here. So if you look at the lower axis there, soil test level, on the nutrient scale from UK, it'll be listed as very low to very high. And so as you look at this scale and you look at yield on the left vertical axis, as you see, if you have a report that's in the low to very low, the yield response by adding some type of fertility is quite large as far as an upward plateau, okay? But as you look at that chart, once you get into the medium to low levels of high, you see that the line sort of does flatten out, okay? So what happens is if we have medium high to high levels of nutrients in the soil for that cropping year, you know, it's not going to help you to add more phosphorus and potassium, okay? And keep in mind that we're not looking at nitrogen in this situation. It's mostly phosphorus and potassium levels that would represent this. So, so if we can just keep our soils primarily in that medium to, you know, low side of high, then really that's all the fertility that we need. But I'm not saying go 2 or 3 years if your soil's in the medium range and not add any fertilizer, because what happens after a year or two, you drop that level of nutrients down in the low to very low, and then you can have dramatic differences in production and viability of plant material. So keep in mind, we don't need an extremely high fertility, but if we've got it already in the soil, that will enable us to maybe reduce our fertility needs and reduce the number of years in between soil testing, which is often 2 to 3 years in between individual tests. Okay. So, so deficiency, if we're in that low to very low, then the opportunity to increase yield, such as bushels per acre, tons per acre, increase growth, will lie in this area. So adding fertility will increase those areas. Once again, the medium range is sufficient. You will see some level of improvement in growth there if you add more nutrients, but not a dramatic increase in production. If you've got excessive or high or very high, then basically you're not going to see any yield increase at all. In fact, if you get too high in some nutrients, you can have a negative impact on production, and that can happen. I don't see it that often, but it can happen. So the critical point here is that low, medium to low range when we really need to be making sure that we're adjusting our fertility in the soil. All right, any questions there? I'm going to stop there before we get into the fertilizers. Any questions from anybody that may be online now? Any questions you might have? Feel free to unmute and ask questions. Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on, and you can feel free. We'll come back in as well here in a second. All right. So I may adding fertility. So if you were to go to a farm store or a garden store, you will find a variety of available ways to buy nutrients. Okay. They can be a liquid formulation where you can, mix them in water like the Miracle Grow there in the lower center. They can be ready to use where you hook it to a garden hose and spray the plant material itself. They can be a granular formulation that that will give usually different levels of nutrients based on how that fertilizer was formulated. So keep in mind, there is a wide variety. And a lot of times you see fertilizers that are basically packaged in such a way that they may be for a specific plant, such as that rose care there from Ortho. You know, they're basically formulating that with the macronutrients and maybe some other, you know, less needed nutrients, but maybe specific to roses. So you get into other fertilizers that are supposed to be, you know, enhance blooming or enhance yield production for tomatoes, for example. So all of those will vary a little bit, but there's a lot of information on that package that will be general information for any and all plants. Okay. I'll highlight just a few of the individual fertilizers that you might have. First of all, organic, and we think of organic that can range from earthworm castings all the way through blood meal, and in between there you've got plant material that's been processed. You've got manures that are often considered organic, and so those particular fertilizers often have less NP and K available. So you're looking at a slower release often in an organic fertilizer, and so we'll cover some of that as we get into this. All right. A lot of folks, especially if you're dealing with large acreages or in some cases just simply in your home lawn or landscaping, there's granular fertilizers out there, and they're probably the more dominant fertilizers we see for those who might need fertility in a little bit larger volume, and in some cases a larger percent active ingredient. Okay, we get into liquids. Once again, a large variety of individual liquids that are ready to use, water soluble obviously, and as you can see there, they range. On that left-hand side, the Peters is 10, 50, 10. So, you know, we'll talk about those numbers and what they mean, but that particular fertilizer has a lot of phosphorus and a limited amount of nitrogen and potassium. Whereas on the right-hand side, those liquid formulations have limited nutrients, period, you know, very low levels based on what's in those particular containers. Okay. Specialty fertilizers, you can get, you know, blood meal for individual, for example, bulbs that you might be planting in the fall of the year. And you can see probably a granular formulation that's been designed for tomatoes and just general vegetables there. Okay. So what do these numbers mean on these bags, okay, or these containers? And this is, you know, basically looking at whether you've got a liquid formulation or a granular formulation. These numbers are going to mean primarily the same thing. So we often see three numbers, okay? And a common one that we can go to any garden store and buy or any farm store is like 1010, and that's just your basic fertilizer that's going to give you, you know, a level of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the first number in that, on that fertilizer bag, is going to be nitrogen. The second is phosphorus, and the next one is potassium. So they'll have a dash in between them. So to think about NP and K. Now, in some cases, you will have another nutrient that they feel like may be important to show on the label, and they could add that as well, whether that would be sulfur, for example, or basically iron is an additional nutrient. But mostly we have those three on the label, and you really have to get into the label before you really understand what other nutrients are in there and what percent they are. So let's assume in a 50-pound bag of fertilizer, or if you're looking at a liquid formulation, you're still looking at a percent. So these are percent nutrients, not, in this case, pounds of nutrients. So if we have a 4600, I'll just give you a couple examples here. that is strictly a nitrogen fertilizer, okay? And it is urea, okay? So that 50-pound bag is 46% nitrogen, or there's actually 23 pounds of actual nutrients or nitrogen in that bag. The rest of it is considered filler, okay? Or in this case, a non-nitrogen source, okay? Then we get into other nutrients such as 1846O, which is a common fertilizer at a garden store, or not, well, at a farm store for sure. And it's got 18% nitrogen and 46% phosphorus. So it's primarily a phosphorus fertilizer. And it's also called DAP, D-A-P, okay? Just another term they use for that particular fertilizer. 0060 is nothing more than potassium or potash, and those two words are interchangeable, okay? In the chemistry fertilized formulations, you hear it called potash, and or you can hear it called potassium. So if you hear those, they're one and the same. So that particular fertilizer would be a fertilizer we often would recommend with alfalfa, which needs a lot of potassium. Whether you're looking at 1010 or in this case 1919, that's your basic fertilizer that will supply a wide variety of nutrients in a given level. Okay, so we see 1010 often used in lawns. We can see it used in landscaping and gardens. So once again, that's 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus and potash. So you can see here the 1919 is just basically almost double that, okay? So we may say, wow, why can't we have a 20-20-20? Well, based on the sources of nutrients going into those, that's the highest that we can get with an individual formulation that is equal in all three nutrient areas, okay? So when I get results back, it will say that I need so many pounds or so many pounds per acre or so many pounds per 1,000 square feet. And when I get those, then I have to take and say, okay, my recommendation is going to be this fertilizer at this rate. All right. So one of the samples that I just showed you earlier asked for 40 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And so that's, I've got to do the simple math to get to the fact that that is 88 pounds of 18 or 046O in that case. Okay. So when I send you the recommendations, I'm basing that on the lab results and what it calls for that particular plant and for that particular year, okay? So just sort of keep that in mind. So those numbers there are basically taking the lab results, what it's calling for, and basically making the recommendations of a specific nutrient type fertilizer, right? So I know that's maybe a little bit more than you need, but let's go from there. All right. So if you was to go to a local farm store, these are examples of fertilizers that you're going to see that's available, okay? And so keep in mind that many of these fertilizers have a fairly specific purpose, and therefore they're formulated differently. So, the 5-20-20 and the 0-25-25, those have very little nitrogen. So those would be fertilizers for a crop that would not need phosphorus and potassium, but would not need much nitrogen for that growing year, okay? Once again, 1919 is a general purpose fertilizer, okay, giving you equal amounts of N, P, and K. And you can see the 1846O giving you nitrogen, but mostly a heavy phosphorus type fertilizer, okay? Urea, 4600. We used to have a 3400, and for you that's been around for a while, would recognize the name of ammonium nitrate. And that was by far the best nitrogen source we had for applying to, homeowner crops, garden crops, in particular larger field crops for a nitrogen source. It was very stable, not like urea, which is very unstable. But now we no longer have that, mainly because of its explosive nature, and the Oklahoma City bombing was primarily a big turning point in the production of ammonium nitrate as we know it today. Now, you can go to southern states today and buy 3400, but if you look on the back of that bag at the ingredient level, you're actually getting urea and a blend of probably what is maybe sodium nitrate, for example. So you're not getting the traditional ammonium nitrate at all, right? You can buy specialty fertilizers, and you can get bags custom mixed to order in 1 ton bags that you can actually use through a custom application. Okay. So we'll get into the nutrients here. Any questions on the fertilizers? Okay, I know that I just touched base on some of those, but just understand that those numbers you see on the label are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and they are percentages. So if you're buying a liquid, that means that liquid formulation. If it's a quart, say for example, then it is 10-10-10 would be 10% of that liquid formulation would be nitrogen as well as phosphorus and potassium. So,
Don?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Excuse me. So you're showing the 19-19-19
Yes,
as a general purpose fertilizer for a homeowner, backyard vegetable garden person.
Right.
I mean, I recognize the fact that soil sample needs to be taken, and analyzed, but in general, would something like that be what a home gardener, vegetable gardener would be getting, or?
Well, yes. If you look at that, I've got general purpose written down, yes. And what it's going to do for you, Sarah, is it's going to give you nutrients that may or may not be needed. So you are basically safeguarding yourself from not having, a nutrient that is at least not available to the plant material, because it's giving you a balanced formulation there of nutrients. So a common one, you may not find triple 19 is readily available in your garden stores. You're probably going to find for sure triple 10, 10, 10, 10, or even 12, 12, 12, or 15, 15, 15. But to answer your question a little bit farther, yes, it is a fertilizer that is a general purpose. Now, what happens is if you take a soil sample and you're high in phosphorus and potassium, then we might tell you to get you just simply a nitrogen type of fertilizer. And that gets a little tricky because it takes a lot less of those depending upon your plants that you're growing. And we'll show some examples of that in a few minutes. So yes, that's just a general fertilizer that most homeowners can and would use, especially if you didn't have a soil sample. Okay. Good question, though. Anything else? Yes.
Don, I've got a big bag of ammonium sulfate.
Right.
And it says on the bag it's sprayable. Okay. Does that mean that I can mix it with water and spray it?
Yes, if you've got some of those, especially the nitrogen, the urea is very water soluble, for example. But man, you just got to be careful and read the label and not over apply, because some of those nitrogen fertilizers can give burning effects and can kill plants. Or if you get too much on, then you're just increasing maybe a lot of growth field that you don't need. And it may take a plant from being productive for blueberries, for example, and a lot of the energy goes into growth and not so much bloom in this case. Right?
Thank you.
So it's really just understanding what the products that you have and reading and following the label And sometimes they'll say so many ounces per 10-foot row, or so many ounces of this material for 100 square feet. And that becomes a little tricky when you're looking at a plant here and a plant there and a plant here. You know, you're concentrating that nutrient in a variety of different situations. So read and follow the label direction is probably the best way to go with that. Okay. Anything else? Good questions though. All right. Once again, nitrogen is a nutrient that we do not test for in a soil sample, okay? And it is extremely important, though, in the production of most plants, okay? So it basically, as you can see here, used for growth and development. It is with the DNA and the genetic code of plants, and it basically is important in the photosynthesis and the chlorophyll production, which is food production in plants. So of all the nutrients that if we had to, not have nitrogen, then basically our food production systems as we know it today would be dramatically reduced if we didn't have a way of supplying additional nitrogen. All right. So as we look at nitrogen deficiencies, and this is not a great picture, but if you look at the text, nitrogen deficiencies, you have small, pale leaves, usually, starting from the bottom of the plant and going up, okay? So you have this yellowing of the older leaves, and if it gets severe, you could have abscesses or browning on those tissues. And what happens is that plant is trying to grow. If it doesn't have enough nitrogen in the soil to furnish that plant, from what it needs to add additional growth, it's going to take the nitrogen from those lower leaves and translocate that up into the younger leaves at the expense of production from the lower leaves. So once they start to yellow and lose basically health, they become unproductive for photosynthesis. They can be more acceptable diseases and so forth, and the whole plant can really begin to suffer because of the lack of nitrogen. On the other hand, don't let something like this, say, oh, this is a nitrogen deficiency. You've got yellow leaves. No, this is an iron deficiency. And a key way that we look and understand that, we have this chlorosis, yellowing of the leaves on the younger leaves, and it's basically between the veins of the leaves. So the veins will remain green. And then between those veins in the leaves, then you have chlorotic yellow type leaves in that case. So this is another, probably a better example of what that might look like. So that is basically an iron deficiency. So in some cases, spraying an iron product on this might help you, but it is often a soil pH issue as well, okay? So it's usually we have plenty of iron in the soil, right? All right, moving on to phosphorus. Once again, very important in a vigorous crop and the growth and production there. It's extremely important in how the water and the nutrients and photosynthesis all works together, and how those processes function in a plant. Phosphorus is important for diseases and pest management in some cases. Having a nice vigorous crop is good resistance to pests, or more resistant. So from a moisture and temperature regulation, phosphorus is important there. And maybe for production ag maturity, having a good end product, whether that be fruit or grain or any kind of a harvestable product, phosphorus is good for quality and quantity. All right. Now, if you have a deficiency, we often look at purple type leaves, especially in younger growth. This happens to show you some couple examples here of a corn plant, and you see a little bit of variation in there, but we often see phosphorus deficiencies early in the spring, okay? If we have cooler temperatures in some types of soils that may have been worked a little bit wet, we might have some level of compaction, then we can see phosphorus deficiencies that will go away in due time, especially if once we get into some warmer temperatures, more phosphorus can be absorbed into those improved root systems. But in some cases, it might be just a complete low level in phosphorus in the soil. And here in Campbell County, low phosphorus is an extremely significant issue, especially on our slopes and hillsides that we have out there in the rural community. I get samples all the time. They're in the low to very low range in phosphorus, and that is an issue for those plants. So usually the darker leaves, the more purplish type leaves is an indication of phosphorus deficiency. All right. Potassium, on the other hand, is often utilized more than phosphorus by most plants, usually about 3 to 1. So every, 3 times more phosphorus is often needed than potassium for plant growth and production. But here you see it's needed for other reasons, but a lot of the same reasons as well, for stand life. In other words, if you've got a crop, we see this a lot in forage crop with grasses and legumes such as red clover and alfalfa. Potassium can play a major role in the stand life of those crops. Okay, phosphorus is good for root production and drought resistance. Once we have a vigorous root system, then we can, that allows that plant to resist at some level during periods of dry weather. Phosphorus is needed for photosynthesis and food production, and it's needed for respiration, which is basically, and transpiration, water loss, and energy transfer, especially at night in respiration. So that's important, and the sugars and the starches as they move throughout the plant's materials there in this case. Phosphorus is important just for standability, getting those crops, whatever they might be, with solid stems and that will hold that plant up, especially with crops that may have heavy production. So we need potassium in the soil or phosphorus or phosphates. Okay, so that's an overview there. And deficiency symptoms often will be yellowing outside margins of the leaf surface. Okay, inner surface will remain green and look normal, but you'll have outside margins that will start to yellow. All right, so that's basically a symptom of potash or potassium. Okay. All right, nitrogen. By far, and once you get your phosphorus and potassium and your soil pH where it needs to be, that does not mean by no means that you have mastered fertility, because here's the one that's often the most trickiest. And understanding when and how much and if you really need additional nitrogen is important, okay? Now, if you're a homeowner and you like your grass green and greener than the neighbor next to you, then a key is nitrogen, okay? If you want to cut your grass twice a week, then you can put nitrogen on it and you can cut it. So, okay? And that's just an example of a crop or plant that we can manage its color and growth is nothing more than the grass in our front lawns, okay, with nitrogen. But when you're looking at plant material that you're going to harvest, vegetables or fruit or anything like that, we need to understand the nitrogen process and when to apply nitrogen. No, I am no chemist by no means, so I won't try to explain the nitrogen cycle, but you can see if you look at that schematic on the right, the very far right, you can see that we can add nitrogen either in the form of organic nitrogen such as manures, plant residues. You can buy your organic nitrogen sources at your stores. I use compost all the time at home for a nitrogen source. I also buy a little bit of urea for my garden site, and that is a nitrogen source. And you might be a little bit surprised to see rain and snow on that list, okay? And just keep in mind that nitrogen makes up about, I think, 80% of the atmosphere or something like that. And as we get rain and particularly snow, those two elements, those two processes can accumulate nitrogen and carry that into the soil. Now, have you ever noticed after a nice couple inches of snow, you go back out, if it stays on for, let's say, 4, 5, 6 days, and maybe it finally warms up and that melts off the grass, you can often notice, well, that grass is greener than it was before it snowed. And there's two reasons for that. One is that you do have the nitrogen that basically is added to the soil from the snow itself as it falls through the atmosphere. And also that snow will form a blanket, and with the added nitrogen and maybe some level of warmth of warming the soil there just a little bit, you will get greener color often in your grasses. So we do have some level of nitrogen supplied that way, okay? But the primary way we add nitrogen, especially in production crops, is through some level of fertility, okay? Being fertilized, okay? So once that fertilizer is added, it has to go through a couple changes to where it's basically made available to the plant roots. Okay, so how it interacts with the soil. And nitrogen is a general rule. It's sort of like free flowing. It does not bond with the soil particles very much at all. So it can very easily be leached out, or it can, depend upon the soil moisture, it can denitrify and leave the soil as a gas. Okay, so those are important things to recognize. So basically, this nitrogen cycle is not complicated, but it is interesting to know that we've got to understand more so when plants need nitrogen and maybe when they don't need nitrogen. So we'll look at that. So the balancing act here is how much fertilizer, how much nitrogen do we need to add based on an individual plant need, and basically what the soil might supply and how efficient that nitrogen source truly is. So those becomes the factors that as you look at soils and you become more agronomist in your own way with the green thumb, it's a balancing act. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we can manage nitrogen, okay? So on a larger scale, okay, if you are a farmer that is basically has a good amount of cropland and you're harvesting, producing corn, which needs a lot of nitrogen, those folks can and must understand the nitrogen process and when and how to apply nitrogen. So in this case, urea would be the primary fertilizer needed here. And I tell folks, if you're applying this in the early spring, you don't get too much loss, okay? When the temperatures are below, let's say 7 degrees and there's moisture at the surface. So you don't get too much loss. But if you get into the early summer months where you get back in the 80-degree weather, and if the soil is sort of dry at the surface, you can get volatilization. And basically what that nitrogen does, it basically forms a gas and basically disseminates back up into the atmosphere. Right? So you can lose about 50% of its value in about 3 or 4 days, okay, if it's not incorporated by rain or some level of tillage. Right? We do have the technology, looking at the second point there are coatings that you can buy nitrogen that have it like an agrotane or a polymer coating on the nitrogen, urea primarily, and it will extend the life of those fertilizers and reduce the loss that you would traditionally have. But one of the ways to protect yourself, if you're putting down these type of products, urea being the main one, is either put it on and wet it in with, if you're on a small scale on a garden site, or incorporate it in with a tillage, or put it on, right before you anticipate a good chance of a rain shower, okay? Because it will need to be incorporated. Right? Now, that is with urea or some of those urea-based fertilizers. If you get into the organic fertilizers, not so much. We can still get loss from surface applications, but those are a different formulation, and they'll be slower to be incorporated and used by a plant material, but you don't get that huge chunk of loss, okay? Now let's get into a couple examples, okay? I throw this picture out because a lot of folks may be doing simply home gardening. And if you have a home garden, understanding when to apply nitrogen can make the difference between, a mediocre crop and a very good crop, okay? So I will have the link for this publication. It is about 60 pages long, and it is an ideal publication for A to Z when it comes to home garden, but it will cover fertility as well in there. I've done a poor job of copying and scanning this, but this is just one page out of that publication. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but it does talk about, doing your own compost, having fertility and how to, apply that. But the table at the top right-hand corner will go through many of the garden crops, and it will talk to you about when to apply nitrogen and how much to apply. And in some of these crops, you're applying, maybe 1 actual pound per 1,000 square feet at planting or seeding, and we may not be applying any other nitrogen throughout the growing season. Whereas on some of these crops, for tomatoes, for example, you may be applying additional nitrogen 2 or 3 times during the growing season, but just a little at a time, and really at specific times, usually after you have a first bloom set and those tomatoes get to be about the size of a golf ball, for example. Those are key times when this document will say you need to be adding a little more nitrogen for extra growth and production, okay? And the same thing for other crops. And some of these crops may say, additional nitrogen can be detrimental to yield and quality. So understanding that, and that publication would give you a lot more insight into that, okay? Now, if it's nothing more than a home lawn, then you've got to pick and choose how much management you want, because you can, it doesn't take a whole lot of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, because all of that material is recycled unless you're bagging up your clippings. But from a growth standpoint and a green color standpoint, some people just go crazy about getting, nitrogen on several times a year to keep it green and growing. And that's okay if you can manage it that way. But for the most part, fall is a good time of year when we definitely, if you want to maintain a good quality thick lawn, we're looking more at fall type applications and usually on a smaller scale than we would if we were at a really high level of management. So there's lawn care companies out there that basically can provide a low service or a very high service depending upon the homeowner's need. And there's a lot of products out there that you can buy and apply yourself with the correct application equipment, and do very well with those applications. And those materials will have on the bag directions for application based on the amount of, often based on the amount of nitrogen that's in those products. All right. Okay, looking at an agriculture standpoint, I know we've got a couple farmers on this program here tonight, but being able to manage nitrogen, whether that would be if you need increased growth for grasses, whether it be for pasture or hayfield. You can see some of the numbers there, usually ranging from 100 to almost as much as 200 pounds per acre if you're looking for increased yield on simply grass hay. Okay, so the timing on that is crucial. Most of these applications are made in let's say late March, early April. Once again, depending upon the yield potential that you're trying to shoot for. Now, if you're looking at hay production, we can come in the fall of the year and give another light application of a nitrogen and boost fall production as well, but we need moisture in that case, okay? I'll cover legumes here later on, but obviously if you have a level legumes, clovers, alfalfas in these pastures and hay fields, then you don't need any nitrogen, period, because those crops can and will supply actual nitrogen to the grasses. Okay. We do have some crops that are out there. It's something as simple as white clover in your lawn can reduce your need for any nitrogen in a dramatic way. So as we look at other crops such as pastures and hay crops, we often try to incorporate legumes into those to eliminate or at least reduce the amount of nitrogen we need, because nitrogen can be an expensive soil amendment. And keep in mind that it's there today, and it's 2 or 3 months from now, that nitrogen you apply today is already gone or used up. Soybeans is another crop that we see as a crop that's for grain, but it's often used in a rotation because it is a legume and it does supply a lot of nitrogen that's carried over into the following season for additional crops, okay? So as you look at the picture on the right, you've got, the wider individual root systems there, and the tanned or reddish are the nodules on those roots, and those are what makes a legume from their ability to absorb nitrogen out of that air that's around the root zone and make nitrogen for itself and also for other plant materials, other root systems that may be adjacent to that, okay? So we can get the increased yield just by simply knowing what is a nitrogen plant in our situation. Just to add some level of value to these, this is mostly from an ag standpoint when we're looking at these numbers, but the possibility of using legumes to make nitrogen in the pounds of nitrogen per acre and how that equates to the dollars and cents is quite large. And we often encourage production agriculture when you're dealing with plant material to use legumes as a part of that mix. Okay. Any questions on those before we switch to manures? Any questions at all? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on. Manure is another opportunity. If you have have animals at the farm, you're going to have manure, especially if you're winter housing these animals during the winter months, whether it be horses or beef cattle or sheep or goats or whatever the case might be. You're going to have some level of manure production from those animals that can and will provide a level of nutrients if you want to treat that as a nutrient source, okay? So we do manure sampling, just like we do soil sampling, we can test your manures. And the main thing is to bring us, once again, a representative sample. And if you look at the upper sample location for the top view there on that right-hand side, the X's, are places within that pile of manure that you can go and take samples. So Stay away from the outside crust. It will have a crust where it will often dry down. Okay, some of those nutrients are still there to some extent, but your best sample would be to get into that pile where you have some level of moisture and a more consistent level of manure in its own situation. Yeah, it's the easiest way, but not always the best way, to collect samples as you're loading or spreading the manure on the farm. Try to get a representative sample, much like you would with the soil test, going into those piles, 2 foot with a shovel in several locations, and getting samples, being able to mix those up in a container, and then being able to bring a sample of that in. When you bring it in, obviously it may or may not have an odor to it. Depends upon how fresh that manure is and how well composted it is. It may not have much odor to it at all. But just to keep the secretary somewhat happy, if you bring it in, please bring it in a double bagged Ziploc bag. Therefore, you're protecting from spillage often, or you're protecting somewhat from the odor it might be emitted. So I know our receptionist, if we get manure comes through the front door, she's calling me and having me come up and deal with it. So, okay, so we do a routine test on this, much like we would your soil, to get the NP and K analysis on that. And we do have some farmers that do test their manure. Most of those have grant monies or grant funds or grant projects through Natural Resource Conservation Service. And part of the requirement for those programs is that they have their manure tested. Once again, I'll give you the link to this, but this is one publication we have at the university that basically gives you more information on using animal manures as a nutrient source. Okay. This slide is taken from that previous slide, just to enlarge that. But as you look at the numbers there, if you look at the nutrient levels of NP and K, let's say for beef, horse is not listed here, and I wish it was, because we're in an area where we have some level of horse manure often produced from folks that are basically boarding horses on a larger scale, or just farmers or homeowners that may have a couple horses, and they can accumulate a good amount of manure over the course of the winter months particularly, and sometimes they make that available to anybody that will come and pick it up, okay? But there is some level of nutrient value in these, in this manure. About 80+% of the nutrients that are entered into these animals will actually be excreted either through the urine or the manure itself. So if you look at beef, for example, it's 11% or 11 pounds per ton of actual nitrogen, 7 phosphorus, and 10 potassium. That's assuming that manure is about 80% moisture, okay? Still a solid, and sounds like it's, wouldn't be, but it's still a solid type manure, not a lagoon liquid type manure at 80%. Once again, horse would be very similar to that. We have very little dairy and swine. If you go to, central and mostly western Kentucky, you get into a lot of poultry manure, and it's going to vary quite a bit based on whether you're looking at broilers or laying hens. So there will be some level of variation in that. And that publication does tell you a little more about application and timing on that. Here's an example. If you go out and you gather in composted manure, for example, or uncomposted manure, and you bring it to your house as an organic source, you're also adding some level of nutrients as well. So if you have access to this, This will give you some information as far as application pounds, you know. And for example, if you had dry cattle manure with limited moisture in it, 180 pounds of that per 1,000 square feet would give you, you know, the 1.2 pounds of actual nitrogen, 1.6 of phosphorus, and 1.8 of potassium. So once again, if you got into this on a more heavier education level, we can manage your nutrient needs on a smaller scale through organic manures. We do have the publications that can advise you on that. One key thing about if you are using animal manures, especially if it's somewhat fresh and hasn't been totally composted, you're going to have a lot of dissipation of the nitrogen, okay? Even though it's maybe, you know, 10 or 11 pounds of this per ton, if you put this nitrogen down and if it's not incorporated either through tillage or if it's not, you know, rained on in a day or two after that, you can begin to lose a lot of the nitrogen source, okay? So you see the percentages there on the right-hand side of that, you know, table there showing if it's incorporated on the same day you apply it, you get about 60% use of that manure for the first year. Some of that is in an organic form that takes a little while longer to break down. And the longer you go without incorporating it, the more you're going to lose. But on the other hand, if you look at the very bottom of that table at phosphorus and potassium, you'll see that most of those nutrients will remain in the soil once they are applied through the manure. So 80% of the phosphorus will be able to be utilized, as well as 100% of the potash in those manures. So the biggest issue you've got to deal with is trying to reduce the nitrogen loss if you're dependent upon your manures to be a nitrogen source, right? All right, any questions on manure? Okay, we do have a good number of farmers that use manure. They have their manure pits where they'll stack the manure during the winter months. We also have horse farmers that collect and clean stalls on a daily basis, and man, they have a big need often for people to be on their list to help pick this up, okay, and utilize it. So most of that manure from a horse standpoint is going to be a combination of manure, some urine, and often shavings or straw as a bedding material. So so that can be composted in probably 4 or 5 months and broken down, and it becomes like the earlier pictures that we had showing compost and organic matter. So quite.
John,
Yes, ma'am.
is there any concern about any kind of contamination manure because of maybe medical treatments of the animals, or because of I don't know, spraying of the area where the pasture area where they graze or anything like that? Is there any concern about that?
I'll answer this in a couple of different ways. There could be, not often on a large scale, but I think as you look at, if you're going to really get into looking at organic manures as a source, I think you'll need to, you can talk to your supplier and get a feel if they're adding any materials other than their feed that might be an issue. I don't know of anything, you know, through the medications and things that would be an issue coming back into food crops, which is if you were using this for the garden site. You know, one of the things we get into is herbicides, and we can get some herbicide carryover. Usually that's broken down over a period of 6 or so months. Let's say that a farmer was using a 2,4-D product to manage broadleaf weeds in a hay field, okay? And if they sprayed that and they harvested even according to guidelines, and it said, 7 days until harvest, some of that residue is still going to be there. And if that manure is used in a green state, in other words, if you picked it up and you brought it home and you put it around your tomatoes, okay, there could be some translocation of that 2,4-D into the tomatoes, and it could have some harm there. We see this more of an issue with homeowners, where they may have a chemical company coming in and they're spraying their lawns with herbicides. They use a mulching mower, but a mower where they're catching the clippings and they compost those or take them back and they use them as, and they put those green clippings maybe around their plants. And we see that more, I think, in traditional home gardening than we do the manures. So that's a roundabout way to answer that, but it's worthy of at least talking to the source, I guess, as much as possible and see if they're adding anything to the feed or anything to the manure source or the stalls that would be of any concern. And then you can always inquire back to us if you have questions in that case. Right?
Thank you.
You bet. Anything else on manures or those type of fertilizers? Okay, just keep in mind that the incorporation time is important. So if you've accumulated a lot of manures and you've got it composted, you're not getting a huge amount of leaching there, and you can incorporate that around your crops when they need the nitrogen or shortly around that. So it does take manures longer to break down and to be used by plants. So it is an organic form, so it's going to not be like a urea type form where it's almost you put it down today and it's available today. It's going to be a little bit slower to be broken down into the nitrate nitrogen source that will be available through the roots. Okay, just a couple slides, and this will talk about traditional agriculture a little bit. And you get some of this removal, but not as much through vegetable production. But this is just to get you to understand that as you harvest plant material off of these crops that you might be growing, you are removing some level of nutrients off of them. And that's why we get into some deficiencies, because if we're removing more nutrients that we're putting back, it's sort of like a bank account that we're overdrawing. And we can go bankrupt from a soil standpoint and have really major problems. So let's take tall fescue, and this could be a tall fescue lawn as well. If you're, basically removing the clippings off of that and putting them in the garbage, we don't want to, that's not a recommendation. But, from a tall fescue standpoint, this is per ton of dry matter coming off of these fields. If we're getting 2 and 3 tons of dry matter per year growth off of these, we're removing, about 40 pounds per ton of nitrogen, and that's hopefully being supplied by legumes, but it may be supplied by a nitrogen fertilizer. On the other hand, we're only removing less than 20 pounds per ton of a phosphorus fertilizer. But we are removing a lot of potassium. And in that case, at 53 pounds, that is actually, for every ton, we're needing to add back 100 pounds of 0060 just to stay sort of at the same production level and same fertility level. So just keep in mind that there is removal of nutrients from the plant material if we're harvesting that and we're not putting any of those nutrients back, okay? So there is a mining of the soil, okay? Putting a little bit of a dollars and cents worth in there, you can, once again, it just saying, if you're removing these nutrients, this is how much you're removing. And if you put a price on it, then basically you are pulling nutrients away that you need to financially, put into your cost of production. And if you're selling products, all of this, it becomes a factor in what you're getting. All right. I won't go over this, but you can see it does take about $68 worth of nutrients if you're just simply producing 2 tons of fescue hay per acre. Okay, that's the value of the nutrients that it takes off for that production. You've got some different numbers for a couple more crops. Okay. One thing we see a lot of farmers do is some will basically sell hay off of their farm, and per ton of hay removed, you're removing at today's prices about $40 worth of plant nutrients. And we have a lot of farmers that are selling hay very cheaply. So, if they're getting $20, $25 a roll bale, they're just barely paying for the plant nutrients that are leaving their farm, let alone the fuel and the time and the wear and tear on their machinery to put up that hay. Right? So just keep that in mind. There is a price cost associated with the fertility that's actually leaving the farm if you are selling hay. All right. A few slides here on animals. Because as we look at animals that might be grazing the fields, okay? So you have inputs as they graze, and obviously some level of production that's leaving the farm in the form of meat or milk or whatever that might be. So a lot of people get into this, looking at, where's the nitrogen coming from, okay? Where's the fertility and what and does it get recycled? So if you take that Hereford cow there, the red Hereford cow, about 80% of what she is eating there gets recycled back through her urine and fecal matter, okay? So the production of milk or meat, if she had a nursing calf, will remove about 20% of those nutrients. So in time, we can actually have deficiencies in even fields like our pastures due to the fact that we are slowly removing those. And another thing I want to mention here is sometimes our cattle, they're not, secreting these manures throughout the entire field, to a great extent, because if we've got a water source that they go to and hang around on, or if they're over in the shade where they're staying out of the hot sun during the summers, a lot of those areas will receive more urine and manure fall than out in the open field. So we're translocating nutrients from the open field into those more higher areas where they're going to stand and drink water and rest. So, but we do get some level of recycling of nutrients through the root systems. So that's really second in nature from the decay of roots, okay, especially obviously roots like red clover and white clover, and the fungi that actually will break down the nitrogen and stuff can release nutrients, and especially nitrogen, but that's only a third of the amount. So most of what we get from the nitrogen cycle is actually from the waste from the cows and the animals that graze those. And we'll tell farmers, say, okay, you need at least 25% stand of clover before you don't have to add fertilizer, okay, or nitrogen fertilizers. So if you look at that photograph on the right, what stands out is the white clover leaves, okay? But if you were to look at it real close, and if you were to harvest it and separate the clover versus the individual swards of grass, In this picture, it's about 75% grass by weight and 25% clover. And so what might look like 25% clover is really, in many cases, probably 10% or less. So in a lot of cases, unless you know you've got a lot of legumes in a hayfield or a pasture, we may be looking at managing nitrogen in order to maximize production. All right. Any questions on that? Because I want to switch here one last set of slides on compaction. So any information on sort of nitrogen, how it, the keys there is to understand the plant needs and when the optimum time is for application of nitrogen, whether that be in organic form or in inorganic form, such as urea. Okay. Any questions you might have there? Okay. Hearing none, I'll move on. All right. One of the things I do see out there, and this can be, in fact, I came home this afternoon, and my wife had a friend or two there, and they were sowing. And one lady asked me about, she lived in a subdivision that they had a lot of trees dying. And as we discussed what her problem might be, it's really the soil. So a lot of times we look at plants above the soil level and we judge them whether they're growing good or poor, and we don't often think about any issues being really related to the soil. We might think of insects or disease or something like that, but often it comes back to what is that soil condition. So whether that would be a landscape or a garden site or a traditional agriculture field of any type, being able to get that balance of nutrients and fertility and pore space is extremely important. And last week we talked about, if we had a volume of 1 gallon of soil, half of that should be basically the minerals, sand, silt, and clay, and some level of organic matter. And the other half of that volume, okay, is going to be air and water pore space. And we like to see that about 25% each in a given ideal soil. But, the schematic on the left side shows, what happens if we have compacted soil. So if we get on the soil when it's a little bit wet, or we till the soil when it's a little bit wet, we can actually compact that mineral part by actually reducing the pore space of that soil. So we're actually changing the dynamics of that soil when we actually work the soil or actually get on that soil with equipment at the wrong period of time. So in this case, we were 72% solid soil in this diagram and 20% water, which is not really too far off what might be needed from a water standpoint, but the pore space for air is only 5%, and that's not going to cut it at all for most plants. So that's just an example of actually what we're looking at from a structure standpoint if we have a compacted soil. All right. A couple things that will and can compact soils is, believe it or not, is your simple rotary tiller that you might have for a home garden. Okay. This is an example of more of what we call a rotavator for smaller fields and for larger, more than just a home garden site. But as those tines actually rotate, at the very bottom of their rotation, where that metal and that soil, hit together, we can form compaction layers, okay? And that layer might be as much as a ½ inch thick, okay? And it basically is compacted by the tillage tool itself, okay? In our simple field discs we have, which, believe it or not, are one of the biggest enemies when it comes to soil compaction is if we disc the field 4 or 5 times in preparation for a plant seeding, and that soil is a little bit on the moist side, a little bit heavy clay, then we can see the detriment of soil compaction. I do have a tool in my office, or actually at home. I have easy access to it. It's called a pentrometer. And during the very wet season, it's a good tool to actually identify whether you have compaction layers in the soil. And so it does allow me or the individual to identify if even if that soil is saturated, we often feel and see based on that pentrometer, it has a meter at the top of it, and it basically will show you how much pressure it takes to push through that compacted area if you have one. So this is an example of basically what the root systems would do if we had a compaction area that was 4 to 8 inches under the ground. We've tilled the soil, it's heavy clay, we've actually formed a compaction layer, and the root systems aren't going to basically penetrate that area. So if we get into a drought situation or a heavy rainfall situation, that water or lack of water becomes an issue. And in this case, those roots are not able to go down in the soil deep enough to really provide stability and a very expanded water or air supply. Then we can get into problem there. Okay, so the right-hand side sort of shows what happens if you have rainfall and it comes down and penetrates that top 4 to 8 inches of soil. And if it hits that compaction layer, it's going to stop, okay? It's not able to move through that layer to be absorbed and retained in the soil. But often we see that it basically will help saturate the soil in that upper 4 to 8 inches. And maybe that water basically just simply runs off at that lower level because it can't penetrate that compacted area. Right? This is a good example of probably what is a soybean root system. You can see the nodules for nitrogen fixation on it. But you see the taproot in this case just went down and hit a compaction layer, and it went the other direction. And so if you imagine that root system being confined to a much smaller depth of area, that in itself can give you major problems in growth and production. So this can happen in your home lawn. It can happen in your landscape. It can happen if you're looking at a new construction area where the soil is compacted. And it can be a difficult situation to deal with, especially if it's 4 to 6 inches under the ground. This is a field that's there on Washington Trace, and I have helped manage that field by 2 or 3 different farmers over the years. And the soil is pretty good there, but it still retains a little bit of moisture. It is not extremely level, but it doesn't allow for surface moisture to run off easily area. So it's going to hold good moisture. And so during periods of either after a heavy rain or especially after spring moisture, we can have a soil that it retains heavy moisture and it doesn't dry out as fast. So as you look at this picture, okay, one of the things I want to show you here is you've got long strips of what would be a greener type foliage, okay? This is basically a fall seeded orchard grass field. Whereas in between these strips, you've got basically lighter, smaller growth and more pale growth, okay? And what is likely the culprit here is knowing when this happened. This particular field was planted, seeded, about 3 days after a 3.5-inch rain, okay? And there wasn't a lot of tillage here, but there was traffic here with the farm implement, okay? And even this was probably compacted a little bit by the summer events as well. So this just sort of shows you. So the tractor tires were running in this direction and that direction, and they weren't traveling here as much, and you get a different compaction area. So if we took that pentrometer and went in here where it's the greenest, we may not have compaction at all. But if we get over here into these areas where it's lighter color green, we might get some compaction, right? So that's just a visual example of what we might have if we get on the soil too quick after moisture is there, right? Not always the case, but compaction can be caused by heavy equipment, okay? And if you look at the left-hand side here, you see a fairly large tractor here with wheel weights and probably significant weight in itself. But in this case, the round baler is probably doing more damage than the bigger tractor, because we've got the weight of this machine plus the weight of the round bale has just been harvested, and we have smaller tires, more narrow tires to really take up the compaction and spread that over a broader area. So in behind these wheels of this round baler, maybe more so than the tractor, we can get compaction there. And the picture on the right here is actually off of that same field that I showed you in the previous slide. And these particular farmer here is harvesting high moisture hay, and these bales may weigh a ton apiece. And so you're talking about a lot of weight on these smaller tires on this particular wrapper, and that can lead to some compaction as well. So what is the key here? Well, prevention is the key, and that's usually soils with higher clay content, high moisture content, and some level of repetitive or high pressure type traffic over these soils when they're a little too wet. So from a standpoint of tillage and getting on these fields, just be smart in your efforts to stay off of these soils when they're wet. If you do get some level of compaction, deep tillage and actually is a good thing to do, and it may not be always in your management is to till these fields. It may not be field that you want to till, okay? And if it's more of a surface compaction layer, usually by those tractor tires and implement tires, over winter's time, this can, and often freezing and thawing, you can break up some of these compaction layers. But if you're looking at a small garden site in situation, landscape type beds, and if you've got a heavy clay soil and to help reduce compaction, or then basically the best thing you can do is try to incorporate organic matter into those, ranging from compost, manures to composted leaves, and those things can be a major improvement in that, okay? All right, quick summary, and I'm going to show you a few more slides of reference materials. Soil test on a regular basis, and if you have soils that come back that have poor fertility or poor soil pH, then you may want to test every year until you get back into that good range of fertility or soil pH. After you reach that, depending upon the production level, then you could go every 2 or 3 years between soil testings, okay? Just keep in mind, you're going to have to apply some level of nutrients in between to keep you from getting into the low range. Fertilizer lime according to the label recommendations that we're going to send you, okay? Avoid compaction if at all possible. Stay off your soils. Add organic matter. Organic matter can be your best friend. Obviously, if you have large acreage, then that becomes a major issue, but organic matter on on some of our lawns and landscaping is just liquid gold or in this kind of situation. And we need to manage some level of vegetation. I didn't cover anything in that in this 2 evenings, but being able to keep a good vegetation cover to reduce erosion on the soil is extremely, extremely important. Right? Now, as we look at reference material, okay, and I'm glad to send these to you. Once again, you can take a snapshot of these if you wish, but we have the very first one at the top. It's actually a forage website, and it has a section in there on soil fertility. And so it's going to have probably 15 or 20 publications that might reference soils of information of some type. So some of those I've listed there is AGR 16, and that's just a numerical number that the UK gives these publications. So that's on soil testing. AGR 1 is a more comprehensive listing of fertility ranging from your lawn and garden type areas to your individual field crops, including row crops and pasture and hay. So it's going to be a little bit more heavier in depth as far as information to understand. AGR 57 will give you an idea of your soil testing, what is it and how does it work and how do you understand the results, okay? And once again, there's a publication on there for using animal manures, okay? So everybody got a snapshot of that one, okay? If you're a home vegetable gardener or a home lawn care type individual and you want to critique your fertility and understand that, I'm glad to send you the Home Vegetable Gardening Hub. It is 60 to 80 pages in length. So it's something you may not want to take the time and print off of your own home computer and try to bind or paper or clip together. It will cover much more than fertility. It'll cover insect control, weed control, just general garden information on each of those, each vegetable, okay? On a home lawn care standpoint, just basically give you some basic information on how to fertilize and maintain a good lawn and landscape, okay? So once again, that first session, you can see the link there. I showed it in that first slide. There's the link once again. If you want to go back and review that, I will. If I've done hit the right numbers tonight and we're recording this, I'll have that up probably as early as tomorrow as well. I can send that information back out to you, but if you go to that link, it will probably show the other link to this evening's session as well. You've got my office number there and my email address. Feel free to call me, email me, at your convenience. I'm always available, whether it's during the week, evenings or weekends. I'll try to get back with you as soon as possible because I do check my emails and things over the weekend. So that's the information there, okay? So any questions or comments that you might have, I just want to thank you for joining me here this evening and last week as well. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can stop recording as well. Okay. Does anybody have any